The air in Section C of the Hoa Lo prison was a thick, suffocating blanket of heat, humidity, and the metallic tang of old blood. It clung to the rough-hewn stone walls, seeped into the cracked concrete floors, and settled deep in the lungs of every man unfortunate enough to reside within its confines. For Bao, the oppressive atmosphere was a constant, physical manifestation of the guilt that gnawed at his insides, far more potent than the stale rice and meager fish served twice daily. He had been here for 8 months. 8 months since the accident. 8 months since the fire. 8 months since Lynn. Lynn, his younger sister, with her bright, inquisitive eyes and a laugh that could chase away the darkest storm clouds. She had been the sunshine in their cramped, impoverished home, a beacon of hope and innocence in a life that offered little of either. He had loved her fiercely, a protective older brother in a world that offered little protection. He remembered buying her that simple white dress for her 12th birthday, saving every meager coin for weeks. The way her face lit up, the genuine joy in her eyes. It was a memory he clung to, even as it twisted into a fresh agony. But love, he had learned, was no shield against carelessness. A faulty wire in the old fan, a moment of distraction while he was pouring kerosene into the lamp, a sudden gust of wind. The details were a blur of panicked screams and searing heat, a chaotic symphony of his own making. The fire had consumed everything, including Lynn, trapped in her small room, her cries echoing in his ears even now. Lynn gone, and he the cause. His sentence was long, a lifetime for a crime he never intended, but one he could never truly deny. The other inmates, a motley collection of thieves, dissidents, and hardened criminals, mostly left him alone. His quiet despair, his gaunt frame, and the haunted look in his eyes made him seem less of a threat, more of a tragic figure. He preferred it that way. Solitude, even in a crowded cell block, was a small mercy. It allowed him to replay the fire, to hear Lynn's final cries, to feel the phantom heat on his skin. It was his penance, a self-imposed torture more effective than any the guards could devise. The prison itself was ancient, a relic of colonial times, expanded and repurposed countless times. Whispers of its dark past were as common as the rats that scurried through the drains, or the persistent smell of mildew and despair. Torture, executions, unexplained disappearances. The very stones seemed to hum with the echoes of suffering. Bao had dismissed them as old wives' tales, the desperate imaginings of men driven to the brink by confinement and hopelessness. Until now, it started subtly, a flicker at the edge of his vision, in the cavernous, echoing cafeteria, where the clatter of tin plates and the low murmur of voices created a dull roar. He saw her. Just for a second, a flash of a familiar, slender figure, her long black hair, unbound, swaying slightly as she moved between the tables. She was wearing the simple white dress she had worn that last day, the one she loved, the one he had bought for her birthday. The sight was so incongruous, so utterly impossible, that his mind immediately rejected it. Bao froze, his spoon halfway to his mouth, a single grain of rice clinging precariously to its edge. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, desperate to escape. He blinked, rubbed his eyes roughly with the back of his hand, and looked again. Nothing. Just the usual sea of grim faces, hunched over their bowls, their movements slow and listless in the oppressive heat. The smell of boiled vegetables and stale fish filled his nostrils, grounding him in the harsh reality of his existence. He shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion, dismissing it as fatigue, hunger, or perhaps the early signs of prison-induced madness. He was constantly tired, constantly hungry. His body ached from the hard labor in the sun. It was to be expected that his mind might play tricks on him. But the image lingered. The way her hair caught the dim light, the slight tilt of her head, the delicate curve of her neck. It was so real, so utterly Lynn. A cold knot of dread began to form in his stomach, a feeling distinct from his usual guilt. The sightings became more frequent, more distinct. yet always just beyond the grasp of full comprehension. It was never a full, solid apparition, but always a fleeting glimpse, a half-seen shadow that resolved itself into Lin's form for a fraction of a second before dissipating. In the common area, where men sat on worn wooden benches, playing worn-out card games with grimy decks, or staring blankly at the peeling paint on the walls, he'd see her. She'd be standing near the far wall, perhaps by the broken window, her back to him, her posture unmistakably Lin's, a youthful grace even in stillness. He'd call out, a strangled whisper, "Lin?" But the name would be swallowed by the drone of the prison, the shuffling feet, the occasional cough, and she would vanish before he could even fully articulate the sound. A cold draft, like the breath of a tomb, would sweep over him, leaving goosebumps on his arms despite the heat. His cellmates, two older men named Hai and Tang, began to notice his odd behavior. Hai, a former farmer with hands like gnarled roots, was gruff but possessed a surprising kindness. Tang, a thin, wiry man who had been in and out of prisons his entire life, had eyes that had seen too much, eyes that held a deep, weary understanding of human suffering. "Bao, you're jumpy," Hai observed one evening, his voice low, as Bao startled violently at a shadow cast by a passing guard. "You see ghosts, boy," Bao scoffed, trying to appear nonchalant, forcing a weak smile. "Just tired. The heat. It makes a man restless." He wiped a bead of sweat from his brow, his hand trembling slightly. Tang, who rarely spoke, merely grunted, his gaze fixed on some distant point on the wall. "This place has a way of getting into your head. Makes you see things. Makes you hear things." Bao wanted to tell them. He wanted to scream, "I see Lin, my sister. She's here. She's watching me." But the words caught in his throat, a bitter lump of fear and shame. How could he explain it? They would think him mad, truly mad, and madness in prison was a vulnerability he couldn't afford. It was a one-way ticket to the dark cells, or worse, to being preyed upon by the more predatory inmates. So he remained silent, clutching his secret like a burning ember in his chest. The ghost of Lin, for he was now certain it was her, never acknowledged him directly in these early days. She was always just out of reach, a silent observer, a phantom echo of his past. But her presence, however fleeting, was a torment. It reopened the wound of his guilt, pouring salt into it with every glimpse, every whisper of her name in his own mind. He started to avoid the common areas, the cafeteria. He'd eat his meals in his cell, huddled in a corner, facing the wall, trying to escape the possibility of seeing her. He would force down the bland food, his stomach churning with a mixture of hunger and dread. He felt constantly watched, even when he was alone. The very air in his cell seemed to thicken, to press in on him. But the prison was small, a brutal labyrinth of stone and iron. An escape was impossible, even from a ghost. One sweltering afternoon, during the mandatory yard time, the sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked concrete, baking the very air. The shouts of the guards, the desultory conversations of the inmates, the distant clanging of metal, it all seemed to fade into a dull hum. Bao stood with his back against the high, pockmarked wall, trying to find a sliver of shade, a moment of respite from the oppressive glare. He closed his eyes, attempting to block out the harsh light and the oppressive reality of his confinement. When he opened them, she was there. Lin. She was standing perhaps 20 feet away, near the rusty pull-up bars, where a few emaciated men were attempting half-hearted exercises. This time, she wasn't facing away. She was looking at him. Her eyes, those beautiful, intelligent eyes, were wide and mournful, filled with an ancient sorrow that seemed to pierce his very soul. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips, a smile that was both heartbreakingly familiar and utterly alien. And then she spoke. Her voice, a soft, ethereal whisper, drifted to him through the oppressive heat, cutting through the low hum of the prison yard, silencing all other sounds in his mind. It was Lin's voice exactly as he remembered it, sweet and clear, yet imbued with an otherworldly resonance that sent shivers down his spine. "Come with me, Bao," she said, her voice like a siren's call, promising an end to his suffering. We will be together forever. A cold dread, far worse than any fear he had ever known, seized him. It wasn't the voice of an angry spirit seeking vengeance. It was the voice of a lonely child, seeking comfort, seeking companionship in the eternal darkness. And that, somehow, was infinitely more terrifying. It twisted the knife of his guilt, suggesting that even in death, he was still failing her, still abandoning her. He stumbled back, hitting the rough stone wall with a dull thud that jarred his teeth. Other inmates glanced at him, then quickly looked away, accustomed to the strange antics of men breaking under the relentless strain of prison life. They'd seen it before. They would see it again. "She's here," Bao mumbled, his voice hoarse, barely audible. "Lin, she's here. Don't you see her?" He pointed a trembling finger, his arm shaking uncontrollably towards the spot where Lin had stood. His breath hitched in his throat, a desperate plea. A guard, a burly man with a perpetually bored expression and a heavy truncheon swinging at his hip, walked past, his boots scuffing on the concrete. "Everything all right, inmate?" he grunted, his eyes narrowed. Bao's finger remained pointed, unwavering. She's right there. Don't you see her? My sister. She's calling me." His voice rose to a desperate, pleading wail, attracting more unwanted attention. The guard followed his gaze, seeing only the empty space near the pull-up bars, the heat shimmering above the concrete. He frowned, a deep furrow appearing between his brows. "See what? You're talking to yourself, Bao. Get some rest. You're looking unwell." He walked away, shaking his head, muttering something about another one gone. Bao stared at the spot where Lin had been. She was gone, vanished as quickly as she had appeared. But her words, "Come with me, we will be together forever," echoed in his mind, a chilling lullaby, a promise of an inescapable reunion. The sun felt colder on his skin. From that day on, the whispers intensified. Lin was no longer just a fleeting glimpse, a half-formed shadow. She was a constant, haunting presence, her form becoming clearer, more defined with each passing hour. She would appear in a laundry room, her form shimmering amidst the clouds of steam, her eyes fixed on him as he scrubbed his meager clothes. In the communal showers, where the water ran cold and the air was thick with the smell of stale soap and sweat, he'd catch her reflection in the grimy, cracked tiles, her face pale and ethereal, yet undeniably Lin's. And always, always her voice soft and insistent, a relentless hum in the back of his mind, then a clear, audible plea. "Come with me, Bao. We will be together forever." He started talking to her, at first in hushed tones, then more openly, his voice raw with desperation. He'd argue, plead, beg her to leave him alone, to return to wherever the dead belonged. "Go away, Lin. Please. You don't belong here. You're dead because of me. Leave me to my punishment," he'd whisper, his voice cracking, tears streaming down his gaunt cheeks. But she would only smile, that unsettling, serene smile, her spectral form drawing a fraction closer, her eyes filled with an ancient, unyielding longing. Her voice, once a whisper, now a soothing balm that promised eternal peace, a peace he knew he didn't deserve, but yearned for with every fiber of his being. "It's all right, brother. It wasn't your fault. We could be together again. Just come with me." His cellmates, Hai and Tang, grew increasingly concerned. They would find him muttering to himself, staring at empty spaces, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a desperate, heartbreaking longing. He would flinch at unseen touches, recoil from unseen presences. "Bao, you need to calm down," Hai urged one night, his voice strained. "You're scaring us. You're scaring yourself." "She's here, Hai. She's right there," Bao insisted, his voice rising, pointing a trembling finger to the corner of their cramped cell where Lin's translucent form now stood, almost within arm's reach. She was watching him, her head tilted, that faint, unsettling smile on her lips, her eyes never leaving his. He could feel the cold radiating from her, a chill that cut through the humid air of the cell. Hai and Tang exchanged a worried glance, their faces etched with pity and a growing unease. They were hardened men, but this was something beyond their understanding, something that touched upon the deepest, most primal fears. "There's no one there, Bao," Tang said gently, his voice laced with a profound sadness. "You're seeing things. It's the guilt, boy. It's eating you alive." "No, she's real. She's always here. She want me to go with her." Bao's voice rose to a frantic, piercing pitch, echoing off the stone walls. He lunged forward, as if to grab Lin, to pull her into a desperate, final embrace, but his hands passed through empty air, meeting only the cold, unyielding stone. He fell to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably, the image of his sister fading before his eyes, leaving him alone with the crushing weight of his reality. The commotion inevitably drew the attention of the guards. Heavy boots thudded down the corridor, and the cell door clanged open. They dragged him to the infirmary, his struggles weak and pathetic. A weary doctor, accustomed to the psychological toll of the prison, to men breaking under the strain, gave him a heavy sedative. He woke up groggy, the whispers temporarily muted by the drugs, but the memory of Lin's presence, her voice, her chilling invitation, was as vivid as ever, burned into his mind. They kept him in the infirmary for a few days, monitoring him, observing his every move. He tried desperately to explain, to convince the doctor, the nurses, anyone who would listen. He recounted the fire, his overwhelming guilt, Lin's spectral appearance, her chilling invitation. He described the way she looked, the way she spoke, the coldness of her presence. They listened with detached professionalism, their faces impassive, nodding, writing notes on clipboards, attributing it all to stress, trauma, and the harsh, isolating prison environment. "It's a common coping mechanism, Bao," the doctor explained, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Your mind is trying to process the loss, the trauma of the fire. You're experiencing severe hallucinations, a form of psychosis brought on by extreme stress." Bao knew they didn't believe him. He knew they couldn't see her. And that, in a way, was even more terrifying than Lin's haunting. It meant he was truly alone in his torment, isolated not just by the prison walls, but by the impenetrable barrier of his own sanity or lack thereof. When he was returned to his cell, his reputation as the Mad One was cemented. Other inmates avoided him, their eyes darting away when he met their gaze, whispering behind their hands about the ghost talker. He was no longer just a tragic figure. He was a pariah, haunted by an invisible specter, a walking embodiment of the prison's insidious psychological decay. He stopped trying to convince them. He retreated further into himself, his world shrinking to the confines of his cell and the ever-present, ever-closer ghost of Lin. Sleep became a luxury he could no longer afford. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her, her face clearer, her smile wider, her voice louder, more insistent. "Come with me, Bao. We will be together forever." He would jolt awake, drenched in cold sweat, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He would sit up, staring into the oppressive darkness, until the first faint, gray light of dawn seeped through the tiny, high-barred window, bringing a temporary, fragile reprieve. The days blurred into a monotonous cycle of fear and exhaustion, each one indistinguishable from the last. Bao's once neat appearance deteriorated rapidly. His clothes were stained with sweat and grime, his hair matted and tangled, his eyes sunken deep into their sockets, bloodshot and ringed with dark circles. He barely ate, barely spoke, his voice reduced to a raspy whisper even when he did. He was a ghost himself, a living shadow haunted by a dead one, fading away day by day. Lin was always there now. Not just a glimpse, not just a whisper, not just a presence. She was a constant, tangible fixture in his periphery, a translucent, shimmering form that moved with him, watched him, waited for him. In the crowded cell, before his cellmates were transferred, she would stand beside their sleeping forms, her presence a cold spot in the stifling heat, a chill that made Hai and Tang shiver in their sleep, though they never knew why. She would lean over him as he lay on his thin mat, her face inches from his, her eyes filled with an unsettling tenderness, a possessive longing. "It's time, brother," she would murmur, her voice now a clear, resonant sound, no longer a whisper, but a gentle, inescapable command. "Come with me. We will be together forever. No more pain, no more guilt, just us." He could feel her cold breath on his skin, the faint, sweet scent of jasmine, the perfume Lin used to wear, now mingled with the faint, cloying smell of decay. It was a torment beyond imagining. The ghost of his beloved sister, the one he had accidentally killed, now beckoning him to an unknown fate, to an eternity of shared darkness. He tried to barricade himself, to hide under his threadbare blanket, pulling it over his head, but she would simply appear on top of it, her form pressing down on him, a weightless, suffocating presence that stole his breath. He tried to scream, to unleash the terror building within him, but only a choked gasp escaped his lips, a pathetic sound swallowed by the silence of the cell. His cellmates, now truly terrified of his increasingly erratic behavior and his incessant, unheard conversations, had requested a transfer. The guards, tired of the constant disruption and the inexplicable chill that seemed to emanate from Bao's corner, had readily granted it. Bao was alone in his cell, a small, dark box of stone and iron, with only Lin for company. He welcomed the solitude at first. Perhaps now, without the judgment of others, without the need to pretend, she would leave. Perhaps her purpose was tied to his interaction with the living. But she didn't. She thrived in the isolation, her presence growing stronger, more vivid, more real. He could almost feel the texture of her dress, the coolness of her skin against his, the delicate brush of her hair. She was almost solid, a living, breathing phantom. One night, the moon, a sliver of silver, cast long, skeletal shadows through the bars of his tiny window. The prison was hushed, save for the distant cries of a night bird and the occasional clang of a guard's boot. Bao lay on his mat, shivering uncontrollably despite the oppressive heat, his eyes wide open, fixed on Lin. She was standing directly in front of him now, her form no longer translucent, but a pale, luminous white, almost glowing in the darkness. Her eyes were still mournful, but now there was an urgency in them, a desperate, undeniable plea. "Come with me, Bao," she said, her voice filling the tiny cell, resonating in his bones, vibrating through the very air he breathed. "We will be together forever, just like we promised." She reached out a hand, her fingers long and slender, beckoning him. He could see the faint outline of veins beneath her skin, the delicate curve of her fingernails, the way the moonlight seemed to pass through her, yet define her. She was so real, too real. The cold emanating from her was no longer just a chill. It was an icy grip that began to numb his limbs. Terror, raw and primal, seized him, a fear so profound it threatened to shatter his very being. This was it. This was the end. She wasn't just haunting him. She was coming for him, to claim him, to drag him into whatever abyss she inhabited. He scrambled backwards, pressing himself against the cold, rough stone wall, digging his fingernails into mortar, his breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps. "No, get away from me," he shrieked, his voice cracking a pathetic, strangled sound. "I won't go. I won't. I deserve to stay here. I deserve my punishment." He lunged for the cell door, rattling the heavy iron bars with all his strength. He pulled, pushed, kicked, his desperate cries echoing in the confined space, a desperate animal trapped in a cage. The metal groaned, the old hinges shrieked, but the lock held firm. It was always locked at night. He was trapped. There was no escape. Lin took a step closer, then another. Her eyes, once filled with sorrow, now held a strange, serene emptiness, a terrifying calm. Her smile widened, no longer faint, but a full, unsettling grin that stretched too far across her pale face, revealing teeth that seemed just a shade too long. "We will be here forever," she whispered, her voice a chilling promise, an unbreakable vow. "Together." Bao screamed, a guttural sound torn from the depths of his soul. a sound that tore his throat. He pounded on the door, his fists bloody and raw, the pain a distant, meaningless sensation. "Help me. She's here. She's real. She's taking me." He turned back to Lynn, his eyes wide with unspeakable horror. She was right in front of him now, her hand reaching out, her fingers brushing his cheek. It was cold, so cold, a bone-deep chill that seeped into his very marrow. He saw her eyes, deep and black, pulling him in, a swirling vortex of eternal night. He felt a profound sense of resignation, a chilling acceptance, as if a heavy, invisible hand had pressed down on his chest, forcing the air from his lungs. The guilt, the fear, the madness, it all culminated in this one inescapable moment. There was no fight left within him. He felt himself being pulled forward, a strange, weightless sensation, as if he were dissolving into the very air. The cold enveloped him, no longer just a chill, but a comforting, all-consuming embrace. Lynn's serene, terrifying smile was the last thing he saw, her eyes holding a terrifying, eternal love, a love that would never let him go. The next morning, the guards made their rounds, the clanking of their keys a familiar, monotonous sound in the silent corridors. Sergeant Tran, a man whose face was as hard as the prison stone, stopped abruptly outside Bao's cell. His eyes, usually sharp and observant, narrowed. Something was off. The usual faint smell of stale sweat and human despair was replaced by a faint, cloying sweetness, like overblown jasmine, mingled with something metallic, almost ozone-like. "Bao!" he barked, rapping his knuckles sharply on the cold iron bars. No response. He peered through the small, grimy peephole. The straw mat was rumpled. The tin bowl sat empty in the corner, but the cell was undeniably, unervingly empty. "What in the devil's name?" Tran muttered, his usual stoicism cracking. He fumbled with his keys, the sound unusually loud in the sudden, profound silence that seemed to emanate from the cell. The heavy door groaned open, revealing nothing but the stark, vacant space. There was no sign of struggle, no broken bars, no hidden tunnels, no trace of his passing. Bao had simply vanished, leaving behind only the lingering chill in the air and that unsettling floral scent. Panic, a rare visitor in the disciplined ranks of the prison guards, began to ripple through the morning routine. Lieutenant Pham, a younger, ambitious officer, was immediately summoned. He arrived, his face grim, and surveyed the empty cell. "Check the perimeter. Search every inch of this block. Get the dogs," Pham barked, his voice tight with urgency. "And pull the surveillance footage from the night. Every camera, every angle." He couldn't have just evaporated. Hours turned into a frantic, fruitless search. Guards scoured every corner of the prison, from the deepest, forgotten dungeons to the highest watchtowers. The sniffer dogs, usually reliable, whined and cowered near Bao's cell, refusing to enter, their tails tucked between their legs. They found no disturbed earth, no torn uniforms, no discarded tools, no signs of an escape. Meanwhile, a small team huddled in the cramped security office, rewinding and fast-forwarding through grainy black and white footage from the previous night. The cameras covered every corridor, every common area, every yard. They watched the hours tick by, the monotonous movements of guards, the restless sleep of inmates. They saw Bao enter his cell at lockdown. They saw the light in his cell go out. They saw nothing. No one approached his cell. No one left. The footage showed only an empty corridor, the shadows lengthening and shortening with the passing hours until dawn. "There's nothing, Lieutenant," a young guard reported, his voice tinged with disbelief. "No one went in, no one came out. The door stayed locked. The window bars are intact." Pham stared at the screen, his jaw clenched. He replayed the segment of time around Bao's disappearance again and again. Nothing, just the static hum of the old recording. It defied logic. It defied every rule of the prison. They interrogated the other inmates, especially Hai and Tang, who were brought in separately. They spoke of Bao's escalating madness, his desperate conversations with an unseen presence, his frantic pleas for help. They spoke of Lynn, the sister he had accidentally killed, the guilt that had consumed him, and the chilling whispers he claimed to hear. The guards listened, their skepticism warring with a growing sense of unease. Some of the older guards, men who had served decades in Hoa Lo, exchanged knowing glances, their faces etched with a grim, unspoken understanding. They had seen strange things in this place. The official report stated unexplained disappearance, a common enough occurrence in the long, dark history of Hoa Lo prison, though usually attributed to escape attempts or internal conflicts, or simply the harsh realities of life and death within its walls. But this felt different. There was an eerie quiet about the cell, a lingering chill that even the midday sun couldn't dispel, a silence that seemed to hum with an unseen presence. The scent of jasmine, faint but persistent, clung to the air around the empty cell for days, a sweet, unsettling reminder of what had transpired. Years passed. The prison continued its grim work, housing new generations of inmates, witnessing new stories of despair and punishment. But the story of Bao, the man who saw his dead sister, became a whispered legend among the prisoners and even some of the older guards. It was a cautionary tale, a chilling reminder of the prison's insidious power, not just over the body, but over the mind and soul. A mystery that no amount of searching or surveillance could ever solve. They say that sometimes, on the quietest nights, when the moon casts long shadows through the barred windows, a faint whisper can still be heard drifting from the empty cell in Section C, a voice that promises an eternal, terrifying reunion. Come with me. We will be together forever. And sometimes, if you listen very closely, you can almost hear a faint, desperate scream, quickly swallowed by the oppressive, ancient silence of the old prison, a silence that has claimed countless souls and now perhaps holds two forever. Bao was never seen again. The Hoa Lo prison, even in the dead of night, never truly slept. It merely shifted from a cacophony of human misery to a deeper, more insidious hum. For Guard Kien, patrolling Section C, this hum was a familiar companion, a constant backdrop to the rhythmic thud of his boots on the cold stone floor. Kien was a man forged by the prison itself, stern, unyielding, his face a mask of weary authority. He had seen men break, seen them scream, seen them disappear into the unforgiving maw of the system. He believed himself immune to the madness that festered in the cells, a contagion of the mind that preyed on the weak. He was the order, the unmoving rock in a sea of despair, the immovable force against the tide of human suffering. His rounds were methodical, predictable, a ritual performed countless times. The familiar clink of his keys against the heavy iron ring, the scrape of his boots on the worn flagstones, the occasional grunt or muffled cough from a restless inmate. But one night, as he passed Cell 7, a cell that had been empty for weeks since its last occupant had been transferred to the infirmary, raving about unseen insects, a new sound pricked at the edges of his awareness. A faint, almost imperceptible scratch, scratch, scratch. It was a sound that seemed to burrow directly into the sensitive tissues of his inner ear, bypassing the outer defenses. Kien paused. He pressed his ear to the cold, damp stone of Cell 7, holding his breath, straining to hear over the distant, mournful cries of a night bird. Nothing. He straightened, frowning, his brow furrowed with mild annoyance. It must have been a rat, a particularly bold one, or simply the settling of the ancient building, its timbers groaning under the weight of centuries of despair. He continued his patrol, dismissing it as a figment of his over-attentive senses. The next night, the scratching was clearer, more distinct. It came from the far wall of Cell 7, the one shared with Cell 8. Scratch, scratch, scratch. A rhythmic, insistent sound, like fingernails dragging across rough stone, or something small, sharp, and persistent trying to abrade its way through solid rock. Kien stopped again, his hand instinctively going to the heavy truncheon at his belt, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the polished wood. He listened intently, his head cocked. The sound was unmistakable now. It was too regular for a rat, too deliberate, too purposeful. It had a cadence, a malevolent rhythm. He shone his lantern into cell 7. The beam cut through the oppressive darkness, illuminating dancing dust motes, but revealing nothing else. Empty. He checked the floor, the ceiling, the tiny, barred window, the very cracks in the mortar. Nothing out of place. No signs of forced entry, no disturbed debris. He then moved to cell 8, peering through the grimy peephole. 3 inmates, huddled on their thin mats, seemingly asleep, their forms barely discernible in the gloom. Kien rapped sharply on the heavy iron door, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the hushed corridor. Silence. What is that noise? He growled, his voice low and menacing, a dangerous tremor beneath the surface. A startled grunt from within, followed by a chorus of muffled protests. No noise, Guard Kien. We sleep. We hear nothing. Kien listened again. The scratching had stopped. Abruptly, he glared at the door of cell 8, a seed of suspicion taking root and blossoming into full-blown certainty. They were mocking him, playing games, trying to test his patience, his authority. He could feel the blood rising to his face, a hot flush of indignation. He walked away, but the irritation festered, growing into a low, simmering rage. He made a mental note. These 3 would pay. For the next few nights, the scratching became Kien's personal tormentor. It would start subtly, a faint whisper of sound, barely audible over the thud of his own heart, then build, growing louder, more insistent, until it filled the quiet corridor, echoing not just in his ears, but in the very marrow of his bones. It always came from cell 7, and every single time he approached, it would cease, as if the unseen perpetrator knew his every move, anticipating his presence with malicious glee. He tried to catch them, to sneak up on the sound, to move with the silent predatory grace he prided himself on, but it was always one step ahead, a phantom playing a cruel game. His sleep began to suffer. Deep, restorative sleep became a distant memory. He would lie on his cot in the guard's barracks, staring at the ceiling, the phantom scratching echoing in his mind, a relentless metronome of torment. His eyelids felt gritty, his head throbbed with a dull ache. He grew irritable, his temper shortening with each passing hour of lost rest, his patience eroding like stone in a relentless downpour. His colleagues noticed his pallor, the dark, bruised circles under his eyes, the way he flinched at sudden sounds. "You look like a ghost, Kien," one of them remarked, a younger, less experienced guard named Min, his voice laced with concern. "Trouble on your rounds? You should report it." "Just restless inmates," Kien grunted, his voice clipped, unwilling to admit to a sound only he seemed to hear, a sound that was slowly, inexorably driving him to the brink. He couldn't afford to be seen as weak, as susceptible to the prison's insidious influence. He was Kien. He was unyielding. One particularly oppressive night, the air thick and heavy, the scratching began almost immediately after he started his patrol. It was louder than ever, a frantic, desperate sound, as if something was trying to claw its way out of the very fabric of the wall. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It vibrated through the stone, a relentless assault on his nerves, a physical vibration that resonated in his teeth, his skull, his very core. He stood outside cell 7, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles were white, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. He could almost feel the vibrations in his teeth, a buzzing agony behind his eyes. The sound was no longer just external. It was internal, rattling his brain. He snapped. The carefully constructed facade of his composure shattered like brittle glass. He threw open the door to cell 8 with a violent shove, the hinges screaming in protest, a banshee wail in the silent corridor. The 3 inmates inside jolted awake, their eyes wide with terror, blinking in the sudden, blinding glare of his lantern. "What are you doing?" Kien roared, his voice raw, a guttural sound torn from deep within his chest. The scratching. "Stop it. You think I don't know it's you? You think you can play games with me?" The inmates, bewildered and terrified, stammered denials, their voices trembling. "Guard Kien, we swear, we heard nothing. We were asleep. Please, we did nothing." Their pleas were genuine, laced with genuine fear. Kien didn't listen. The words were meaningless noise against the deafening roar of the scratching in his head. His mind was a whirlwind of sleep deprivation, mounting rage, and a terrifying certainty. He saw only their feigned innocence, their mocking eyes, their smug satisfaction at his torment. He raised his truncheon, the heavy wood whistling through the air with a sickening whoosh, and brought it down on the nearest inmate's head. A sickening, wet thud, a choked cry of pain, and the man slumped, blood blossoming dark against his pale skin. Kien hit him again and again, a mindless, brutal rhythm, until the man lay still, a broken, twitching heap, his skull visibly caved in. The other two cowered, scrambling into the farthest corner of the cell, screaming for mercy, their pleas turning into terrified whimpers. Kien, consumed by a red haze, a blinding fury, turned on them, his blows fueled by an unholy, unreasoning rage, a primal scream tearing from his own throat. He beat them until their screams died, until their bodies were limp and lifeless, their blood pooling on the cold concrete floor, mingling with the dust and grime. When he finally stopped, panting, sweat stinging his eyes, mingling with the spatter of blood on his face, the three inmates lay broken and bleeding on the floor, their bodies twisted into grotesque shapes. Cell 8 was silent, save for the ragged, shallow breathing of one of the men, a sound that quickly faded into nothingness. And from Cell 7, from the wall shared with Cell 8, the scratching continued. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Kien froze. His blood ran cold, colder than the stone beneath his feet, colder than the death he had just dealt. It wasn't them. It had never been them. The horrifying realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, a sledgehammer to his already fractured sanity. The scratching had moved. It was still in Cell 7, but now it was coming from the other wall, the one dividing it from the empty corridor. It was impossible. It defied the laws of physics, the very reality he had so rigidly clung to. He stumbled back, his eyes wide with a terror that transcended mere fear, a cosmic dread that ripped through his being. This wasn't human. This was something else. Something that defied logic, defied the very walls of the prison, defied understanding. The scratching was inside his head. It had always been inside his head. It was a parasitic sound, a malignant growth in his brain. He stumbled out of Cell 8, leaving the bloody, grotesque scene behind, and stood in the corridor, staring at the wall of Cell 7. The scratching intensified, 1,000 tiny claws tearing at the inside of his skull, ripping at his very thoughts. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It was a maddening crescendo, a relentless assault that threatened to rip his mind apart, to shred it into a million pieces. He had to make it stop. He had to. The thought was a desperate, burning imperative. He ran to the guard station, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, his eyes wild, his uniform stained with blood. He grabbed a pickaxe, a heavy, brutal tool used for breaking through stubborn masonry, its sharp point gleaming malevolently. The other guards, startled by his wild eyes and desperate demeanor, by the blood smeared across his face, tried to stop him, shouting questions, reaching for him. "Kien, what are you doing? You're bleeding. Stop." He shoved them aside with a strength born of pure madness, an animalistic fury. He staggered back to Cell 7, the pickaxe heavy in his hands, its weight a comforting anchor in the storm of his mind. The scratching was deafening now, a cacophony of 1,000 tiny devils clawing at his brain, a symphony of pure, unadulterated torment. He raised the pickaxe high above his head, its steel glinting dully in the dim light, a desperate, final resolve hardening his features. "Stop it!" he screamed, his voice hoarse, unrecognizable, a raw, primal roar. "Stop it! I'll find you. I'll kill you." He brought the pickaxe down with a primal roar, smashing it into the wall of Cell 7. Stone chips flew like shrapnel, dust exploded in a choking cloud, and a gaping, ragged hole appeared in the ancient masonry. He swung again and again, a frantic, desperate rhythm, his muscles screaming in protest, but he felt no pain, only the burning need to silence the sound. The wall crumbled under his assault, revealing the dark, empty space within, a void that seemed to mock him. He paused, panting, sweat and dust streaking his face, the pickaxe hanging limply in his hands. The scratching. It was still there, but now it was coming from the other wall of cell 7, the one that faced the main prison yard. It had moved again. It was mocking him. It was everywhere. It was nowhere. It was a part of him. A horrifying laugh bubbled up from his chest, a broken, guttural sound, filled with a terrible, desperate joy. He dropped the pickaxe, letting it clatter to the floor with a final metallic clang. His hands went to his head, pressing against his temples, his fingers digging into his scalp, as if to crush the sound, to silence the torment, to tear the scratching from his very brain. The scratching was inside him. It was him. He stumbled, his eyes wide and unfocused, seeing nothing but the endless, maddening scratching behind his eyelids, a frantic, internal tearing. He turned to the solid, unyielding stone wall of cell 7, the wall that had held his torment, the wall that was now the only escape. He had to make it stop. There was only one way. With a final, desperate cry that was more animalistic than human, a raw, tormented shriek, Kien threw himself against the wall, smashing his head against the rough stone. Once, twice, a sickening crack echoed through the silent corridor, followed by a wet, dull thud as his skull fractured, bone grating against stone. He collapsed, a broken heap of flesh and bone, his body twitching convulsively, blood blooming dark and viscous on the gray stone, forming a macabre halo around his head. His eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, a faint, unsettling smile on his lips, as if he had finally found peace in the ultimate, absolute silence. The other guards who had followed him, their faces pale with shock and horror, watched in stunned silence. They rushed forward, but it was too late. Kien lay motionless, his lifeblood seeping into the ancient stone. They dragged his body away, cleaned the blood with grim efficiency, and sealed cell 7 once more, bricking up the gaping hole he had made. The incident was quickly hushed up, attributed to a sudden, violent psychotic break, a common enough tragedy in the brutal confines of Hoa Lo. The 3 dead inmates in cell 8 were reported as victims of a prison riot, a convenient lie that no one dared to question too closely. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the prison settled into its deeper hum, some guards swear they can still hear it. A faint, persistent scratch coming from the empty cell 7. A sound that has no source, no explanation. A sound that echoes the madness that once consumed Guard Kien and perhaps still lingers within the very stones of Hoa Lo prison. A constant, chilling reminder of the horrors that transcend physical walls. The scratching continues. It always does. The Hoa Lo prison, a monolithic beast of stone and iron, held within its ancient walls a silence far more terrifying than any scream. It was a silence born of countless generations of suffering, a heavy, suffocating blanket that swallowed sound, hope, and sanity alike. For Hong and his younger brother, Min, this silence was their constant companion, broken only by the clanging of cell doors, the distant shouts of guards, and the ceaseless, internal hammering of guilt. They had arrived together, shackled, their faces bruised, their futures irrevocably intertwined with the grim fate of the prison. Their crime was murder, a desperate act of self-preservation gone horribly wrong in the chaos of street brawl. Hong, the elder, had always been the protector, the quick-thinking one, the one who navigated the treacherous currents of their impoverished lives. Min, quieter, more introspective, had followed his brother's lead, as he always had. But in that moment, in the frantic blur of fists and knives, it was Huang's desperate thrust that had found its mark, silencing their attacker forever. And it was Min who had stood by him, frozen, a silent accomplice, the shock of the violence etching itself onto his young soul. They were brothers, bound by blood, now bound by a shared horror and the cold, unyielding embrace of Ho'olo. Their cell was a small, damp rectangle, barely large enough for two thin mats. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, unwashed bodies, and the faint, ever-present stench of human waste, a constant reminder of their confinement and degradation. Hong, ever the pragmatist, tried to adapt, to find a routine, to survive the relentless grind of prison life. He forced himself to eat, to exercise, to maintain a semblance of control. Min, however, retreated deeper into himself, his eyes often distant, lost in a world only he could see, a world that seemed to be slowly consuming him. It began subtly, with Min's restless nights. Hong would wake to the sound of his brother muttering, thrashing on his mat, his body slick with sweat, his hair plastered to his forehead. When he woke from these nocturnal struggles, Min would be disoriented, agitated, his limbs twitching as if still caught in the throes of struggle. "Another dream, Min?" Hong would ask, his voice low, trying to soothe, trying to pull his brother back to the grim reality of their cell. Min would only shake his head, his eyes wide and unfocused in the dim light. "The walls, Hong. I see the walls, but differently. Like they're transparent. I see what's behind them. What's under them? A network. A maze." Hong dismissed it as the prison getting to him. The mind, he knew, played cruel tricks in captivity, twisting reality, conjuring illusions to fill the void of freedom. But as the weeks bled into months, Min's dreams grew more vivid, more detailed, more disturbingly precise. He started talking about corridors they had never seen, about ancient, forgotten passages, about pipes running through unseen spaces, about the faint hum of electrical conduits buried deep within the stone. "There's a passage," Min whispered one morning, his voice hoarse from a night of particularly violent thrashing. "Behind the old water heater in the communal bathroom. Not the one they use, but the one that's just a rusted shell. It leads down." He described the heater's exact model, the pattern of rust on its side, the specific chip tile directly beneath it. Hong scoffed, a dry, humorless sound. "A passage? Min, you're dreaming. That heater's been there for decades. It's solid concrete behind it. I've seen them patch it countless times." He tried to sound dismissive, but a flicker of unease stirred within him. "No, Hong, not solid. There's a seam, a hidden door. It's old, rusted, almost fused with the wall, but it's there. And below it, a shaft. It goes down into the earth. I saw it. I walked through it. I felt the cold. The air down there, it's different. Heavy." Min's eyes, usually clouded with despair, now held a strange, unsettling clarity, a burning intensity that made Hong uneasy. He spoke with the conviction of someone who had truly experienced what he described. Hong humored him. He had to. Min was his brother, his only tether to sanity in that hell. During their next communal shower time, a chaotic, hurried affair under the watchful eyes of the guards, Hong casually lingered near the ancient, rust-streaked water heater. He ran his hand along the cold, damp concrete behind it, feeling for any anomaly, any crack or fissure that might betray a hidden space. His fingers brushed against something, a faint line, almost invisible, where the mortar seemed to shift, where the stone felt subtly different. He pressed harder, his heart beginning to pound with a frantic, unfamiliar rhythm. It was there, a seam, a shiver, colder than the damp air, traced its way down his spine, a premonition of something profound and terrifying. That night, Hong couldn't sleep. The image of the seam, the impossible seam, burned behind his eyelids. "Min," he whispered, nudging his brother, his voice barely audible in the suffocating darkness. "The heater. You were right. There's a seam." How did you know?" Min's eyes snapped open, already awake, it seemed. His gaze pierced the darkness. "I told you. The dreams. They show me everything. And there's a camera. In the corner of the exercise yard, near the broken wall, where the old drainage pipe used to be. Hidden in the shadow of the guard tower. It's old, but it works. Its lens is cracked slightly on the top right. and the wiring for the main lights in Section B runs through a conduit directly beneath the floor of the laundry room, under the third washing trough. It hums a low, constant vibration like a trapped insect. You can feel it if you press your ear down. Hong felt a cold dread creep over him, a dread far deeper than the fear of discovery. These were details no one outside the prison staff, perhaps not even all of them, would know. He had seen the camera, barely noticeable, its lens almost swallowed by the shadows, and had always wondered about the strange hum beneath the laundry room. But Min, who rarely paid attention to anything but his own internal torment, couldn't possibly know this. It was impossible, yet he did. Over the next few days, Hong subtly verified Min's claims, his skepticism slowly, inexorably crumbling. He saw the camera precisely where Min had described it, its dull lens glinting faintly in the harsh sunlight, the tiny crack visible upon closer inspection. During laundry duty, he knelt, pretending to tie his shoelace, and pressed his ear to the concrete floor beneath the third trough. A faint, undeniable hum vibrated through the stone, a low, electrical thrumming that was almost imperceptible unless you knew to listen for it. His skepticism had not just crumbled, it had been utterly annihilated, replaced by a terrifying, exhilarating possibility. Escape, the word, once a forbidden fantasy, a cruel joke whispered in the dark, now sang itself in his mind like a sacred promise, a beacon of light in their endless night. Min's dreams became his obsession, and Huang's only hope. Every morning, as the first gray light filtered through the cell bars, Huang would lean in, desperate for the new fragments of the map Min's subconscious had drawn. Min would describe the labyrinthine passages with chilling precision, his eyes unfocused, as if still navigating the unseen depths in his mind. The old ventilation shaft in the kitchen, near the bread oven. It's partially blocked by debris, but the dreams show me how to clear it. It connects to a crawl space above the guards' mess hall. The air there smells of stale cigarettes and old cooking oil. And from there, a vertical shaft, barely wide enough for a man, descends into the old cisterns beneath the prison. They're disused, flooded in parts, but there's a path, a narrow ledge, just above the water line, leading deeper into the earth. It's slippery, treacherous, covered in a slick, black moss, but it's there. Min would describe it, his voice a monotone, yet filled with an undeniable authority. The main power lines, the ones that feed the perimeter lights, they run along the ceiling of the second level of the cisterns. You can follow them. They hum a low, deep thrum like a giant sleeping beast. They lead to the old sewer outflow pipe, beyond the outer wall, into the river. The river is wide and fast. We can swim. Hong devoured every detail, his mind a sponge. He stole a pencil stub and a few scraps of paper, sketching crude maps in the dark, memorizing every turn, every landmark Min described, every potential obstacle. He drew the layout of the prison, the laundry room, the kitchen, the guard mess hall, then the intricate, unseen pathways below, the cisterns, the ledges, the outflow pipe. The initial fear of Min's madness was replaced by a desperate, almost religious, belief in his prophetic visions. He's not mad, Hong told himself, clutching the crude map, tracing the imagined lines with a trembling finger. He's our only way out. He's the architect of our freedom. He started to believe that perhaps Min was touched by something ancient, something that allowed him to perceive the hidden veins of the earth, the forgotten arteries of the prison. The planning became their secret life, a desperate game played under the very noses of their captors. They discussed the guards' patrol patterns, the changing of the shifts, the precise moment the communal bathroom would be empty enough. They saved scraps of food, hoarding them for the journey, drying stale bread into hard, tasteless biscuits. They fashioned a crude lamp from stolen wick and some rancid oil, its flame a tiny, fragile symbol of hope, a flickering defiance against the overwhelming darkness. They even managed to acquire a small, sharpened piece of metal, a makeshift tool to pry open the rusted panel. Every stolen moment, every whispered conversation, every calculated risk fueled their desperate hope. The night they chose was dark, Moonless, a heavy, tropical rain lashing against the prison walls, a symphony of natural chaos that would hopefully drown out any sounds they made. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a fitting overture to their desperate gamble. Hong felt a tremor of fear, a cold knot of apprehension in his stomach. But Min was calm, almost serene. His eyes glowed with an unnerving certainty, a quiet confidence that settled Huang's nerves, a strange, almost ethereal glow in the dim light of their cell. "It's all here," Min whispered, tapping his temple. "Every turn, every pipe, every step, it's etched into my mind. We'll be free, brother." After their showers, as the other inmates shuffled back to their cells, their bodies steaming in the humid air, Hong and Min lingered. The air was thick with steam and the metallic tang of rust, the scent of mildew and damp stone. Hong moved to the old water heater, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a drumbeat of desperate hope. He found the seam, a faint line of corrosion and decay, almost invisible to the casual eye. With a sharpened metal tool, he began to pry. The rusted panel, surprisingly, gave way with a low, grating groan, a sound like a dying beast, revealing a dark, narrow opening, barely wide enough for a man to squeeze through. A blast of cold, damp air, smelling of earth and stagnant water, rushed out, bringing with it a faint, unsettling odor of something ancient and disturbed, something that made the hairs on Huang's arms stand on end. "This is it," Hong whispered, his voice tight with a mixture of terror and exhilaration, his breath catching in his throat. Min, without hesitation, without a backward glance, slipped into the opening. Hong followed, scraping his shoulders against the rough stone, the darkness swallowing him whole, thick and absolute. The panel creaked shut behind them, plunging them into absolute blackness, a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing in on them. The passage was narrow, forcing them to crawl on their hands and knees, the stone rough against their palms, scraping against their knees and elbows. The air grew colder, heavier, thick with the smell of damp earth and something else, something ancient and metallic like old blood and forgotten iron. Hong fumbled for the small, crude lamp they had fashioned, his fingers trembling, but the flame flickered weakly, casting more shadows than light, illuminating only the immediate, claustrophobic confines of the tunnel. The shadows danced around them, grotesque and menacing, elongating with every flicker of the dying flame. "Down," Min whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space, distorted by the stone. "Always down. The dream showed me. We must go deeper, past the old foundations." They crawled, then shuffled, then descended a series of crumbling, uneven stone steps, their hands scraping against slick, moss-covered walls. The steps seemed endless, spiraling deeper into the earth, each one colder than the last. The sound of dripping water was constant, a monotonous rhythm in the oppressive silence, a chilling soundtrack to their desperate journey. Huang's claustrophobia began to set in, a tightening in his chest, a desperate urge to turn back, to feel the open air, even the foul air of the prison yard. He imagined the tons of earth and stone above them, crushing them, burying them alive. The air grew thinner, making each breath a conscious effort. "Min, are you sure?" Hong whispered, his voice trembling, barely a breath, laced with rising panic. "It's so dark, so cold. There's been so much time since we started descending. My head aches. Are we even going the right way? What if the dreams are wrong?" Doubt, a venomous serpent, began to coil in his gut, its fangs sinking deep. "Down," Min whispered, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space, distorted by the stone. "Always down. The dreams showed me. We must go deeper, past the old foundations." They crawled, then shuffled, then descended a series of crumbling, uneven stone steps, their hands scraping against slick, moss-covered walls. The steps seemed endless, spiraling deeper into the earth, each one colder than the last. The sound of dripping water was constant, a monotonous rhythm in the oppressive silence, a chilling soundtrack to their desperate journey. Huang's claustrophobia began to set in, a tightening in his chest, a desperate urge to turn back, to feel the open air, even the foul air of the prison yard. He imagined the tons of earth and stone above them, crushing them, burying them alive. The air grew thinner, making each breath a conscious effort. "Min, are you sure?" Huang whispered, his voice trembling, barely a breath, laced with rising panic. "It's so dark, so cold. There's been so much time since we started descending. My head aches. Are we even going the right way? What if the dreams are wrong?" Doubt, a venomous serpent, began to coil in his gut, its fangs sinking deep. "The cisterns are deep," Min replied, his voice calm, unwavering, a stark contrast to Huang's rising panic. "We're almost there. I can feel it. The map is clear. It's all in my head. Every pipe, every crack." His certainty was both reassuring and terrifying, a beacon in the encroaching darkness. They reached a wider section, a vast, echoing chamber, the air thick with the smell of stagnant water, a sickly sweet smell that made Huang gag, a scent of decay that seemed to cling to his very clothes. The weak lamplight revealed massive, crumbling stone pillars disappearing into the inky blackness above and below, their surfaces slick with unseen slime, glistening wetly. This had to be the cisterns. The sound of water lapping against unseen edges was unnerving, a soft, hungry whisper in the dark, as if something vast and unseen stirred beneath the surface. The power lines, Min pointed into the darkness, his arm a pale, indistinct shadow, his finger unwavering. Along the ceiling, follow the hum. They show the way. The hum of freedom. Huang strained his ears. A faint, almost imperceptible hum vibrated through the air, a low thrum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a vibration that resonated in his very bones. He saw the faint glint of metal high above, disappearing into the darkness, a shimmering thread of hope, a fragile lifeline in the terrifying void. They began to navigate the narrow ledge Min had spoken of, a treacherous path along the edge of the water, their hands pressed against the cold, slimy stone, their feet sliding on the slick surface. The water below was black, utterly opaque, reflecting no light, hinting at unimaginable depths. The hum of the power lines grew stronger, a guiding beacon in the terrifying black, a constant, low thrumming that seemed to vibrate directly inside their skulls, a pressure building behind their eyes. Huang's mind screamed at him to turn back, to abandon this madness, to face the known horrors of the prison rather than the unknown terrors of this subterranean world. But Min pressed on, his movements sure, his face a pale, determined mask in the flickering lamplight, his eyes fixed on some unseen point in the darkness, a destination only he could truly perceive. "We're close, Huang," Min murmured, his voice now almost a song, a hypnotic cadence that seemed to pull Huang forward against his will. "I see the outflow. Just a little further. We'll be free. We'll finally be free." The air grew colder still, a biting, unnatural cold that seeped into their bones, making their teeth chatter uncontrollably, their muscles seize, their bodies trembling. It was a cold that felt ancient, primordial, as if they had descended into the very core of the earth, into a place where time had no meaning. The lamp flickered, its tiny flame struggling against the encroaching cold, then sputtered, then died with a faint hiss, plunging them into absolute, suffocating darkness. Huang cried out, a strangled sound of pure panic, his voice swallowed by the vast, echoing void. "Min, the light. I can't see anything. Where are you?" His voice was a desperate plea, filled with a terror that clawed at his throat, a raw, animalistic fear. Min's voice, now strangely distant, yet right beside him, replied, "It's all right, brother. I can still see the map. It's clearer now, in the dark. It's all here. It's always been here." His voice was calm, too calm, utterly devoid of fear, and it sent a fresh wave of dread through Huang, a chilling realization that something fundamental had shifted within his brother. Huang extended his hand, desperate to grab his brother, to pull him back from the precipice of the unknown, but his hand met only empty air. The cold intensified, a freezing embrace that stole the breath from his lungs, a weight crushing him from all sides. He felt disoriented, utterly lost, unsure of which way was up, down, or forward. The hum of the power lines was gone, replaced by a profound, echoing silence, a silence that seemed to throb with an unseen presence, a vast, patient entity. Then a voice. It was not Min's. It was deep, resonant, ancient, and seemed to come from all around them, from the very darkness itself, from the stone, from the water, from the air. It was the voice of the prison, of the earth, of something far older and more terrible than any of them, something that had been waiting for centuries, perhaps millennia, for this precise moment. Finally, you have arrived. The voice rumbled, a chilling whisper that vibrated through Huang's entire being, shaking him to his very core, rattling his teeth. I've been waiting. The cold intensified, a crushing weight that squeezed the air from Huang's lungs. He tried to scream, to fight, to claw his way back to the surface, but no sound escaped his throat, no movement came from his paralyzed limbs. He felt himself being pulled, not by hands, but by an unseen force, a vast, hungry emptiness that consumed all light, all warmth, all hope. He felt men beside him, a fleeting, icy touch, then nothing. The darkness embraced them, a final, suffocating shroud, pulling them deeper into the earth, into an oblivion from which there was no return. They were gone, lost to the depths, forever part of the prison's unseen, unspeakable horrors. Two more additions to the ancient, suffering chorus of Hoa Lo. The whispers of the prison continued, now with two new, silent additions to its ancient, suffering chorus, forever trapped in the architect's shadow. The Hoa Lo prison, a sprawling monument to human suffering, held secrets far darker than its notorious history of political dissidence and brutal interrogations. Beneath its crumbling facade, within its very foundations, a different kind of horror festered, a clandestine operation run by men who saw the inmates not as souls to be broken, but as commodities to be harvested. Guard Kien was one of these men. His face, usually impassive, harbored a cold, calculating glint in his eyes, a reflection of the grim pragmatism that allowed him to participate in the harvest, as they grimly called it. Lai was a veteran guard, hardened by years of witnessing despair and the casual brutality of the system. He had served 2 decades within Hoa Lo's unforgiving walls, rising through the ranks not by merit, but by a chilling blend of efficiency and moral flexibility. He, along with a small, trusted circle of colleagues, the stoic Sergeant Vu, whose silence was as unnerving as his presence, the jovial but ruthless Corporal Bao, whose laughter never quite reached his eyes, and the ever-watchful Nurse Trang, whose hands, though capable, seemed devoid of warmth, had perfected their shadow trade. Their operation was a macabre ballet of precision and secrecy, a well-oiled machine of death and illicit profit. Inmates, usually those with no family or connections, those whose disappearance would raise minimal questions or whose files were conveniently misplaced by corrupt clerks, were selected. The criteria were simple: good health, young age, and utter anonymity. They preferred those who had been recently admitted, still plump with the remnants of a life outside, before the prison's meager rations could truly waste them away. A network of informers within the prison, bribed with extra food or small luxuries, would flag potential candidates. The chosen ones were given a slow-acting poison in their meager meals, a concoction expertly blended by Dr. Tran, the disgraced surgeon, to mimic the symptoms of a rapid, aggressive illness, dysentery, cholera, or a virulent fever that would leave them writhing in their bunks for days. No suspicious marks, no overt signs of violence, just a swift, agonizing decline over 3 to 5 days, culminating in a final, agonizing collapse. The prison doctors, either complicit or conveniently incompetent, would sign off on the death certificates, attributing the demise to natural causes or epidemic complications, their pens scratching out the lies that sealed the victims' fates. When the chosen prisoner reached their final, gasping throes in the sick bay, barely clinging to life, their friend Nurse Trang would intervene. Trang, a woman whose face was a mask of professional concern, her voice a soothing murmur meant to calm the dying, but whose eyes held a chilling emptiness, would declare the inmate beyond saving, under the pretense of providing comfort in their last moments, or moving them to a more private room for their final rest. She would guide the dying man to a secluded, forgotten room in the deepest, most isolated part of the prison's basement. This room, once a storage locker for old, rusted medical supplies, was now their operating theater. It was dark, perpetually damp, and smelled of stale blood, strong disinfectant, and a faint, cloying sweetness that Lai had never quite identified, a scent that clung to the air like a shroud. There, a clandestine doctor, Dr. Tran, a former surgeon disgraced by a botched operation and now bound to their illicit trade by a combination of blackmail and insatiable greed, waited. His hands, though stained with the unholy work, were surprisingly steady despite the grim conditions and the flickering lantern light that cast grotesque shadows on the walls. Organs, kidneys, livers, even eyes, sometimes hearts, were meticulously removed, packed in ice, and later smuggled out through a hidden tunnel that led to the old river docks for sale on the burgeoning black market. It was a lucrative, horrifying business, a silent epidemic of natural causes deaths within the prison walls, generating illicit wealth that bought silence and complicity, weaving a web of corruption that reached high into the prison hierarchy. Lee's role was crucial. He would ensure the corridors were clear, the other guards distracted by manufactured incidents or extra rations of rice wine, the path to the basement secure. He would stand watch outside the heavy, creaking door, his truncheon held loosely, his face a picture of bored vigilance, his mind a blank slate against the horrors within. He rarely entered the room during the procedures, preferring to keep the gruesome details at a distance, to maintain his carefully constructed detachment. He was a cog in a machine, a necessary evil, and he prided himself on his ability to compartmentalize, to remain unburdened by the suffering he facilitated. He had seen enough death in his life. He didn't need to witness its intimate, bloody details. Until the night of Prisoner 47. Prisoner 47 was a young man, barely out of his teens, arrested for petty theft. He had wasted away quickly under the poison, his once bright eyes now sunken and clouded, his skin a sickly yellow, almost translucent. Lai had seen him being escorted by Nurse Trang to the basement room, his body already convulsing, his breath rattling in his chest like dry leaves in a storm, each gasp a desperate plea for air. Lai took up his usual position outside the door, his back to the rough stone wall, listening to the muffled sounds within. The doctor's low, clinical instructions, the faint clink of instruments against metal trays, the wet, sickening gurgle of fluids, the soft, tearing sounds that made his stomach clench despite himself. He focused on the distant sounds of the prison, the rhythmic drip of a leaky pipe in the corridor, the faint cries of a disturbed inmate in another section, anything to keep his mind from the horror just beyond the thick, rotting wood. Then a sudden, sharp gasp from inside the room. Not a scream, but a sound of profound, agonizing realization, a final, desperate intake of breath, as if the very soul was being ripped from the body. And then silence. A heavy, unnatural silence, broken only by the frantic pounding of Lee's own heart, a drumbeat of rising dread. A moment later, Nurse Trang emerged, her face pale, her eyes wider than usual, a faint tremor in her usually steady hands. A bead of sweat, cold and clammy, traced a path down her temple. "He's gone," she whispered, her voice tight, almost a gasp, her gaze fixed on some unseen point beyond Lee's shoulder. As she stepped aside, Lai glanced into the room. Dr. Tran was hunched over the crude operating table, his back to the door, his movements precise as he worked, a dark silhouette against the dim lantern light. And on the table, prisoner 47, his chest already laid open, a gaping, crimson maw, the ribs splayed back like a broken birdcage, glistening wetly in the faint light. But it wasn't the sight of the exposed, glistening organs or the raw, violated flesh that froze Lai. It was prisoner 47's head. His eyes, though glazed with death, were fixed directly on Lai, on him, with an impossible, burning intensity, a gaze that seemed to pierce through his very being. And from his blood-flecked lips, a faint, raspy whisper escaped, a sound that cut through the thick air, bypassing Li's ears and burrowing directly into his skull. A chilling, inescapable invasion. "I will come back for you." Lai flinched, a cold shock rippling through him, raising goose flesh on his arms, making his skin crawl. He shook his head violently, dismissing it. A dying man's last breath. A hallucination brought on by the grim atmosphere. A trick of the flickering lantern light. He shrugged, forcing a nonchalant expression, a practiced mask of indifference that felt suddenly fragile. "Get on with it," he muttered to Trang, his voice rougher than he intended, turning away from the gruesome scene, his gaze fixed on the empty corridor. But the words, "I will come back for you," echoed in his mind, persistent and chilling, a new, unwelcome resident, a phantom whisper that refused to be silenced. That night, Lai couldn't sleep. The phrase repeated itself, a phantom whisper in the suffocating darkness of his barracks. He tossed and turned on his thin cot, his body clammy with sweat, his mind replaying prisoner 47's dying gaze, the impossible clarity in his eyes, the unnatural stillness of his body. He dismissed it as fatigue, a consequence of the grim work, a momentary lapse in his iron control. He tried to rationalize it, to find a logical explanation, but none came. But then came prisoner 81, a grizzled old man with a hacking cough and a lifetime of hard labor etched onto his face, poison for his surprisingly healthy kidneys. As he was wheeled past Lai, his body racked with spasms, his eyes, roomy and distant, suddenly snapped open, locking on Li's with an unnerving lucidity. His lips, blue with oxygen deprivation, barely moved, yet Lai heard it, clear as a bell. Inside his head, a voice that seemed to bypass his ears entirely. "I will come back for you, for what you took." Then prisoner 105, a young, athletic man, chosen for his strong heart, his muscles still taut despite the poison ravaging his insides. As Nurse Trang guided his stumbling form past Lai, his eyes rolled back, then snapped forward, focusing on Lai with a clarity that defied his dying state. A thin, bloody froth bubbled at his lips as he whispered, not with his mouth, but directly into Li's mind, a chilling, guttural sound. "I will come back for you. We will feast." And prisoner 21, a quiet scholar, whose intellect had been deemed useless, but whose liver was pristine, a prize for the black market. As he lay convulsing on the gurney, his eyes, filled with a profound, knowing sorrow, met Li's. And the words, though his mouth was clamped shut, resonated in Li's skull with a chilling, mournful certainty, a voice that seemed to come from the very depths of his own consciousness. "I will come back for you. The debt must be paid." At first, it was a whisper, then a chorus. The voices accumulated in his head, a growing cacophony of dying men, each one distinct, each one repeating the same phrase, layering over each other, building into a relentless, maddening hum. He heard prisoner 47's youthful rasp, prisoner 81's guttural groan, prisoner 105's high-pitched wheeze, prisoner 21's calm, scholarly tone, now joined by others, a rising tide of spectral accusation. They followed him from the prison yard to the mess hall, from his barracks cot to the latrines. He tried to drown them out with alcohol, with loud conversations, with the clanging of metal, with the screams of other inmates, even with the self-inflicted pain of biting his own tongue. But they were always there, a constant, insidious presence within his own skull, a parasitic infestation of sound, a legion of the dead demanding his attention. Lai began to unravel. His once impassive face became gaunt, his skin sallow, his eyes bloodshot and haunted, ringed with dark, bruised circles that seemed to sink deeper with each passing day. He flinched at sudden sounds, started violently at shadows, his nerves frayed beyond repair, his body trembling uncontrollably. He would mutter to himself, arguing with the unseen chorus in his head, his hands often going to his temples as if to physically press the voices down, to silence the clamor within. His colleagues noticed his rapid decline, the way his uniform seemed to hang loosely on his shrinking frame. "Lie, you look like death," Sergeant Vu remarked one morning, his voice gruff, a hint of concern in his eyes, though he kept his distance. "You're not sleeping. Are you ill? Perhaps a few days off?" "Just the heat," Lai mumbled, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper, his hand instinctively going to his temple, as if to press the voices down. "And the noise. The damn inmates. Always making noise. Can't you hear it?" Corporal Bao, usually jovial, frowned, his brow furrowed with confusion. "Noise? It's been quiet, Lai. Quieter than usual, actually. The new sedative program is working wonders." Lai glared at him, his eyes wild, darting frantically around the barracks. "Quiet? Are you deaf? It's a constant din. A buzzing, a scratching, a screaming. They're all screaming. Can't you hear them? They're everywhere." He clamped his mouth shut, realizing he had said too much, his secret spilling out like blood from a fresh wound. He began to avoid his colleagues, preferring the solitude of his rounds, where at least he didn't have to pretend the voices weren't there. But the solitude only made them louder, more insistent, more terrifying. They were his constant companions, the spectral victims of his grim trade, their numbers growing with each passing week, each new harvest adding to his tormentors. He started seeing them too, fleeting glimpses at first, like the inmate Bao from Section C had claimed, but then more vivid, more substantial, more horrifyingly real. A half-seen shadow in the corridor would resolve into the emaciated form of prisoner 47, his chest a gaping hole, his eyes fixed on Lai with an unblinking, accusatory stare that pierced his very soul. In the mess hall, he'd see prisoner 81, his liver missing, his spectral hands reaching out, his mouth silently forming the chilling words, a silent, damning accusation. In the infirmary, he'd see prisoner 105, his heart cavity empty, his phantom fingers tracing the outline of his missing organ, a macabre dance of what was lost. They were always just out of reach, their forms shimmering, translucent, yet terrifyingly real, their voices a relentless, maddening chorus. "I will come back for you. We will come back for you. We are waiting. We are hungry." The psychological torment became unbearable. He was trapped, haunted by the very men he had helped to dispatch, his carefully constructed detachment utterly shattered. The guilt, once a distant, manageable concept, now clawed at his insides, a searing, physical pain, amplified by the spectral presence of his victims. He knew he was going mad. He knew it with a chilling, undeniable certainty, a truth whispered by 1,000 dead men, a truth that screamed from the depths of his own tormented mind. He could feel the threads of his sanity fraying, snapping one by one. One particularly oppressive night, the air thick with humidity, the voices in his head reached a fever pitch. They screamed, they whispered, they pleaded, they roared, all repeating the same terrifying promise, a deafening symphony of vengeance, a chorus of the damned. Lai couldn't take it anymore. He had to prepare the basement room for another harvest. He had to face them. He had to make it stop. He had to end it, one way or another. He descended the narrow, winding steps to the basement, his lantern casting dancing, grotesque shadows on the grimy walls. Each step echoed the thud of a body being dragged, the clink of instruments, the muffled cries of the dying. The air grew colder with each step, thick with the familiar scent of stale blood and decay, now overlaid with that cloying, sickly sweet jasmine, a scent that now made his stomach churn with revulsion. He reached the heavy, creaking door of the operating room, its surface slick with unseen grime, its wood dark with countless stains. He pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest, a sound like a dying man's last breath, and stepped inside. The room was dark, empty, save for the crude operating table in the center, its surface stained with old, dried blood, a testament to countless gruesome acts, a silent altar to their depravity. He turned to close the door behind him, a habit, a ritual, a desperate attempt to seal himself off from the outside world, to face his tormentors alone. The heavy wood swung shut with a resounding thud that vibrated through the floorboards. And then, the unmistakable click of the lock. From the inside, a cold, metallic click that echoed in the sudden silence. Life froze, his blood running cold, colder than the deepest parts of the prison, colder than the grave. He tried the handle. Locked. He was trapped. A sudden, absolute darkness enveloped him. The lamp in his hand sputtered, its tiny flame shrinking, then died with a final, desperate gasp, plunging the room into an inky blackness that pressed in on him from all sides, suffocating him, stealing his very breath. He cried out, a raw, terrified sound, his voice swallowed by the suffocating void, his screams stillborn in his throat. The voices in his head, once a chorus, now became a deafening roar, 1,000 screams of agony and vengeance, each one a blade twisting in his mind, tearing at his sanity. Then, with a blinding flash, a searing white light that seared his retinas, leaving ghostly afterimages, the lights flickered back on. Like gasped a strangled, choking sound, his eyes wide with unspeakable horror. The room was no longer empty. It was packed with them. Every surface, every corner, every inch of the small, damp room was filled with the spectral forms of the inmates he had helped to kill. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a silent, horrifying legion, their numbers far greater than he could have imagined, a sea of vengeful dead. Their forms were translucent, shimmering with a sickly, internal glow, a faint phosphorescence that illuminated their grotesque features, but terrifyingly real. Their faces were gaunt, their skin stretched taut over bone, their eyes hollow and filled with an ancient, burning hatred, a silent accusation that pierced him to his core. And every single one of them was an open corpse. Their chests were split open, revealing empty cavities where organs had been harvested, dark, gaping voids that seemed to suck in the light. Their bellies were slit, their limbs bore the marks of crude incisions, some with the flesh peeled back, revealing glistening muscle and sinew, others with dark, congealed blood staining their spectral forms. Some were missing eyes, dark sockets staring blankly into his soul, others livers, others kidneys, others still their very hearts, leaving gaping, impossible wounds. They were the grotesque, mutilated echoes of his victims, brought back from the grave to claim their due, an army of the wronged. Their silent presence a deafening roar of condemnation. The air grew impossibly cold, a freezing embrace that stole the breath from Lee's lungs, making his teeth chatter uncontrollably, his entire body tremble, his skin turning blue. It was a cold that felt ancient, primordial, as if they had descended into the very core of the earth, into a place where time had no meaning, where the laws of life and death were inverted. The jasmine scent was overwhelming now, sickly sweet, cloying, mingled with the metallic tang of fresh blood and the putrid stench of decay, a nauseating perfume of death. The chorus in his head, the whispers of "I will come back for you," now erupted into a unified, guttural roar that vibrated through the very foundations of the prison, shaking the stone, rattling the bones of the dead, a sound that threatened to shatter his eardrums. "We are here," they screamed, their voices a thousand-fold echo of their dying breaths, a unified cry of vengeance that tore through Lee's ears, a physical assault of sound. "We came back for you, for the harvest, for what you took." Lee stumbled backward, pressing himself against the cold, damp wall, his eyes darting frantically from one horrifying face to another, seeking an escape that did not exist, a reprieve that would never come. He tried to scream, but only a choked sob escaped his throat, a pathetic whimper of despair. He tried to move, to run, to fight, but his limbs were paralyzed by terror, his muscles locked in a rigor mortis of fear, his body a useless shell. The spectral figures began to move. Slowly, inexorably, they shuffled forward, their translucent, mutilated forms converging on him, a tide of vengeful spirits, their hollow eyes burning into his. Their hands, pale and ethereal, yet terrifyingly real, reached out. They were not solid, yet he felt the chilling cold as they passed through him, as they grasped at his flesh, their touch like ice and fire simultaneously, a searing, freezing agony. He felt a tearing sensation, a searing pain that was both physical and spiritual, a violation that went beyond the body, beyond anything he had ever conceived. They used their hands, their spectral fingers, to rip him apart, not with brute force, but with an otherworldly precision, a chilling echo of the doctor's scalpel, a perverse mimicry of their own demise. He felt his skin tear, his muscles shred, his bones crack, all without a single drop of blood, without a single mark on his uniform. It was a tearing from the inside out, a violation of his very being, an unmaking, a slow, agonizing dissolution. He saw his own spectral organs, still whole, still intact, being pulled from his body by spectral hands, held up to his screaming face, glistening with phantom fluids, a horrifying mirror of his crimes. He felt his heart being torn from his chest, still beating, still pumping phantom blood, its rhythm slowing, then stopping. His lungs collapsed, his eyes bulged, his vision blurring. Lai screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony and terror that echoed through the silent prison, a sound that no living guard would ever hear, a scream that only the dead could truly appreciate, a final, desperate testament to his undoing. He felt himself dissolving, his consciousness fracturing, his very existence being unmade by the vengeful spirits, pulled into the same void they inhabited, a void of eternal torment. The last thing he saw was the multitude of hollow eyes, filled with eternal hatred, as the darkness consumed him, pulling him into the same chilling void from which they had returned. The next morning, the guards found the basement room locked from the inside. They had to break the heavy door down, the splintering wood echoing in the sudden silence. The air inside was impossibly cold, thick with the cloying scent of jasmine and something else, something metallic and utterly chilling, a scent that made even the most hardened guards recoil. On the crude operating table, Guard Kien lay. His body was intact, no visible wounds, no blood. But his face was a mask of unspeakable horror, his eyes wide and staring, his mouth frozen in a silent scream. And his chest was caved in, as if something had reached inside and simply pulled his organs out through his skin, leaving a perfectly clean, empty space, a chilling void. His skin was cold to the touch, colder than any corpse. The doctor and Nurse Trang, summoned to the scene, their faces paling to an ashen gray, exchanged a single, terrified glance. Their eyes, usually so devoid of emotion, now held a profound, sickening realization. They knew the harvest had claimed one of their own, and the debt was being collected. The official report stated heart attack, a convenient lie that silenced questions and preserved the fragile order of the prison. The basement room was sealed, bricked up, never to be used again, its dark secrets buried once more. But in the quiet hours of the night, when the prison settled into its deeper hum, some guards swear they can still hear it. A faint, chilling chorus of whispers from the sealed basement, 1,000 voices promising retribution, a relentless, eternal demand. We came back for you. We are here. We will come back for you. And sometimes, if you listen very closely, you can almost hear a faint, desperate scream, quickly swallowed by the oppressive, ancient silence of the old prison, a silence that has claimed countless souls, and now, perhaps, holds one more, eternally harvested. Guard Kien was never seen again, at least, not in a recognizable form. Years later, a new recruit, a young man named Tan, arrived at Hoa Lo. He was eager, ambitious, and oblivious to the whispers that clung to the old stones, the dark currents that flowed beneath the prison's grim exterior. He was assigned to Section C, and quickly found himself under the wing of Corporal Bao, now a grizzled veteran whose jovial demeanor had a new, unsettling edge, a faint tremor in his hands that he often tried to hide. Bao had seen too much, done too much, and the prison had left its indelible mark on him. One sweltering evening, as Tan walked his first solo night patrol, his boots echoing in the empty corridor, the air thick with humidity, he passed the sealed-off section of the basement. A faint, cloying scent of jasmine, mingled with something metallic and cold, drifted from behind the bricked-up wall. He paused, frowning, a prickle of unease on his skin. Then, a whisper, clear as a bell, directly into his mind. It was a voice he had never heard, yet it resonated with an eerie familiarity, a cold, empty echo that seemed to bypass his ears and settle directly in his consciousness. It was Lee's voice, raspy and filled with an eternal, chilling hunger. "Corporal Bao, I will come back for you. We are waiting. The harvest continues." Tan flinched, looking around wildly, his heart suddenly pounding. No one, just the oppressive silence of the prison, broken only by the distant drip of water. He shook his head, dismissing it as fatigue, a trick of the mind, the heat playing games with his senses. He continued his patrol, his pace quickening, but a seed of dread had been planted deep within him. He didn't know why, but he suddenly felt a profound, inexplicable chill, a sense of being watched, of being chosen. He didn't know it yet, but the harvest had a new target, and the Architect of Shadows had just extended an invitation. The cycle, in Hoa Lo, was eternal, and the prison, in its endless hunger, always found a way to collect its due. The whispers would grow louder, the shadows would deepen, and the debt, eventually, would be paid.